September 17th, 1983, Atlantic City, New Jersey. A 20-year-old woman walks onto the most watched stage in America, and 63 years of history hold their breath. For 63 years, the rules of the Miss America pageant stated in plain language that contestants must be of the white race. That rule had been quietly removed in 1950. But in 33 years, since not one black woman had won that crown. Not one. Until tonight. If this story moves you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a story that matters. And for the first time in the history of one of America's most celebrated institutions, the woman wearing that crown is black. Her name is Vanessa Williams. She is 20 years old. And what happens next, what America does with this moment, with this woman, with this door that just cracked open, is one of the most important tests this country has ever run on itself. America failed that test, and what Vanessa Williams did in the aftermath of that failure is the story worth telling. Consider what it would mean to stand in her shoes. 21 years old, you have just made history. You have become the symbol of hope for millions of people who never thought they would see this day. You did everything right, and then through a betrayal you never saw coming. Through no fault of your own, the entire country turns on you. The organization that crowned you gives you 72 hours. The late-night hosts are already writing the jokes. The industry is already closing its doors. What would you have done? Feel the weight of that question, because that is the only way to understand what she chose to do next. Before the crown, before the cameras, before the history books, there was a little girl in Millwood, New York, learning very early, very clearly that excellence was not optional. It was armor. Vanessa Lynn Williams was born on March 18th, 1963 in the Bronx. Her parents, Milton and Helen Williams, were both music teachers, educated, devoted, the kind of parents who had fought for everything they had and intended to give their daughter more. They moved the family to Millwood, a quiet, predominantly white suburb north of New York City, when Vanessa was just 12 months old. They put something on her birth announcement, a joke, a prayer, a prophecy written in ink before she could open her eyes. Here she is, Miss America. In 1963, when black women were not allowed to compete, they wrote it anyway. Growing up in Millwood meant growing up as one of the only black faces in most rooms. Piano, violin, French horn, classical dance, jazz. Music was not a hobby in the Williams household. It was a requirement because Milton and Helen understood that talent fully developed and relentlessly practiced is the one thing no institution can legislate away from you. She graduated high school with a presidential scholarship for drama, one of 12 students in the entire country to receive it that year. She chose Syracuse University's College of Visual and Performing Arts. She had a plan, a serious plan. She was going to be a performer on her own terms, in her own time, without asking anyone's permission. What she did not plan for was a beauty pageant. In the spring of 1983, the campus musical she was set to perform in was canceled. A friend suggested the Miss Greater Syracuse pageant, partly for the experience, partly for the scholarship money. Vanessa was not interested. She had never competed in a pageant. She did not see herself as a beauty queen. She was a theater student, a serious artist with no interest in being judged on a stage in a swimsuit. She changed her mind. She won Greater Syracuse. Then she won Miss New York. And then on September 17th, 1983, 6 months after entering her very first beauty pageant, she walked onto the stage in Atlantic City. For 63 years, Rule 7 of the Miss America pageant had required contestants to be of the white race. That rule had been quietly dropped in 1950. But in the 33 years since, from 1950 to 1983, not one black woman had worn that crown. Not one. In 33 years of technically being allowed, not one had made it all the way. Until tonight. The crown came down. The sash went on. And across America in living rooms from Harlem to Houston, people who had lived through the civil rights movement, people whose parents had been told they were not fully American, watched their television screens with tears streaming down their faces. Elderly people stopped Vanessa on tour and held her hands with trembling fingers. Everywhere she went, they told her the same thing that they never thought they would live to see this day. But here is what the celebration paper's over. She was one of 5 minority contestants that year. Another black contestant, ballet dancer, Deneen Graham, Miss North Carolina, had already had a cross burned on her front yard before the national pageant even began. A cross burned on the yard of a beauty queen in 1983. That is the America that handed Vanessa Williams a crown, and she wore it anyway. Here is what the history books leave out. When Vanessa Williams made history, she did not receive universal celebration, not from every corner of her own community, not from every corner of any community. Some white Americans refused to recognize her. Hate mail arrived. Death threats arrived for the first time in pageant history. A reigning Miss America required additional security. Letters poured into the organization, insisting that a black woman could not be the face of their America, but that was only one front. Within certain segments of the black community, there was a different kind of pressure, quieter, more complicated, and in some ways more painful to carry. Some felt she was too light-skinned to truly represent black America. Others would later feel, when the scandal broke, that she had brought shame onto a community that had staked something real on her success. 20 years old, making history, and being told simultaneously that she was too black for some and not black enough for others, that she was a liability or a disappointment, depending on who was doing the judging, that there was no version of her success that everyone would accept. There was no crown she could wear that didn't come with a target. She wore it anyway. Now we go back to the summer before any of this happened. 1982, freshman year at Syracuse. Vanessa was 19 years old looking for summer work. She responded to an ad seeking models. The photographer's name was Tom Chiappel. Chiappel had a concept: 2 models, nude silhouettes, the light positioned behind them to make the bodies abstract and unidentifiable. Shapes and forms, not faces. She would not be recognizable. The photographs were described as private, meant only for him, never to be published. She would be protected. She was 19, alone in a studio, being asked to do something she was not comfortable with by someone she had no reason yet to distrust. She was reluctant. He was reassuring. She agreed. And then she walked out, went back to college, back to theater, to the pageant she never intended to enter, to the crown she never planned to win, to the history she never asked to make. For almost 2 years, those photographs sat somewhere in the dark. Then in the summer of 1984, weeks before her reign was set to end, Tom Chiappel sold them to Bob Guccione, the publisher of Penthouse magazine. Explicit photographs, published without her consent, published without her knowledge, published with her name, her title, her face attached, Miss America, Hugh Hefner. The publisher of Playboy, who had been offered the same photographs first and turned them down, spoke publicly about what had actually happened. The single victim in all of this, he said, was the young woman herself, the one whose right to make this decision had been taken away from her. The Miss America pageant board gave her 72 hours. Not, how can we protect you? Not, you were exploited and we stand with you. Not, this was done to you without your consent and we will fight alongside you. 72 hours, and then go. She was not disqualified. She was abandoned. On July 23rd, 1984, Vanessa Williams stood before the cameras at a press conference in New York City, 21 years old, composed, devastated, and gave them exactly what they demanded: a graceful exit. An exit that protected the institution while the institution offered her nothing in return. And then America showed her exactly who it was. The late-night hosts opened their monologues. Joan Rivers, whom Vanessa had admired and met personally during her reign, was relentless, returning again and again with jokes at her expense. The wife of legendary lyricist Ira Gershwin blocked her from a theatrical audition, declaring that she would never allow that woman in her show. Her parents, the music teachers, the devoted builders, faced shame and harassment in their own community. America didn't just watch her fall, America needed her to fall. Because here's the truth that nobody said out loud in 1984, but that everybody felt: a black woman who had broken through a door that was never meant for her, who had worn a crown that had been explicitly reserved for white women for 63 years, who had made millions of people believe that the story of America included them. That woman needed to be brought down, not because of what she had done wrong, but because of what she represented. Because a symbol of that kind of power, standing that tall, was something that certain corners of this country could not allow to remain standing. They didn't take her crown. They revealed who they were. Here's the question worth sitting with. If those photographs had been published without her consent today, in 2024, with all the tools and conversations we now have, would the institution have protected her? Would America have done better? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation that needs to happen. After the press conference, Vanessa Williams went home, and she fell apart. Not in public. The public never saw that version of her. The cameras did not follow her into the private wreckage. What the world saw was the composed young woman at the microphone. What happened after that belonged only to her. There were nights when the phone rang, and she knew, before she answered, that it was another door closing. Another role gone. Another opportunity that had evaporated because her name had become a punchline the industry was not ready to move past. There was an audition, a theatrical role she had earned the right to pursue, where she was turned away not because of her talent, but because of 1984. Because powerful people in that room had decided that what had been done to her defined her more than anything she had built, before or since. She later described those years as a decade in which she was the punchline to every late-night monologue. 10 years, not a rough patch. A decade of walking into rooms that had already made up their minds. A decade of being not just good enough, but so undeniably excellent that not even the memory of what had been done to her could be used as a reason to close the door. She did not always feel strong in those years, but she kept showing up. And that the showing up when you don't know if it's working, the walking through doors that have been slammed in your face so many times you've lost count, that is where the real story lives. In 1987, she married Ramon Hervey II and began the work of rebuilding in an industry that had decided it was over. And then she made a choice that nobody expected. She did not come back quiet. She did not come back apologetic. She did not come back as the chastened, reformed version of herself that the industry was waiting for, the version that would bow her head and ask for forgiveness and promise to be smaller this time. She came back loud. In 1988, she released The Right Stuff, a debut album soaked in New Jack Swing. Swing energy, all rhythm and confidence and unapologetic swagger. The sound was not the sound of a woman in retreat. It was the sound of a woman who had looked at everything they tried to do to her and decided, I am still young, I am still here, and I am not ashamed. That was a radical act in 1988. To be Vanessa Williams, to put your name on music that moved like that, to walk back into the entertainment industry, not as a cautionary tale, not as a redemption story asking for sympathy, but as an artist demanding to be taken seriously on her own terms. There were rooms where people still saw 1984 when she walked in, where they had already written the ending before she opened her mouth, where her name arrived before she did, trailing the weight of everything that had been done to her. And then she opened her mouth, and they had to listen, because the voice was real, the talent was undeniable, and the woman behind it had spent years developing something that no press conference, no forced resignation, no late-night monologue could touch. She kept going, album after album, performance after performance. And then came 1992. Save the Best for Last reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 5 weeks. Millions of copies, Grammy nominations. But if you were black, if you had watched what they did to her, if you remembered 1984, you heard something different in that song. You heard a woman who had been written off telling the entire country, I saved the best for last. Everything you tried to take, I kept the best of it. And now I'm standing in the place where you told me I'd never stand again. That was not just a hit record. That was a victory lap in front of everyone who had ever laughed at her name. She was still here. From 2006 to 2010, Vanessa Williams played Wilhelmina Slater on the ABC hit series Ugly Betty. Wilhelmina was the most powerful woman in a fictional New York fashion magazine, ruthless, brilliant, magnificently dressed, the kind of woman who walked into every room like she owned it because in every room she entered, she did. Wilhelmina Slater never explained herself. She never apologized. She never lowered her eyes or softened her voice for anyone. She looked at the people who had underestimated her and she did not argue with them. She did not try to convince them. She simply proved them wrong with such devastating completeness that the argument became unnecessary. Never explain, never complain, and here's what deserves to be said plainly. That was not just a character. That was a philosophy. And Vanessa Williams had been living it for 30 years before she played it on screen. For 30 years, through the forced resignation, through the decade of closed doors, through the late-night punchlines and the blocked auditions and the rooms where people still saw 1984 when she walked in, she had never gone on television and begged for her reputation back. She had never held a press conference to explain herself. She had never asked the people who had laughed at her name to feel sorry for what they had done. She just kept working. She kept creating. She kept building. She kept showing up in rooms that expected her to fail and leaving them with something they could not dismiss. And then she came back to the industry that had tried to freeze her out, not as a supporting player, not as a cautionary tale asking for forgiveness, but as Wilhelmina Slater, the most powerful woman in the room, in an industry that had spent years treating her as damaged goods. 3 Emmy nominations for Outstanding Supporting Actress. The industry that had tried to erase her name was now putting it on nomination ballots for its highest honors. Never explain, never complain. She had been living that line her entire life. September 13th, 2015. Vanessa Williams walks back onto the Miss America stage for the first time since 1984. She is 52 years old. Head judge. Invited back by Sam Haskell, the CEO, the man who had been one of the judges the night she was crowned 32 years ago. She does not know what is coming. She performs Oh How the Years Go By, chosen deliberately loaded with time. She stands on the stage when it is over and waits. Sam Haskell walks to the microphone. He says that he has to right a wrong, and then in front of a live national audience, he delivers an apology on behalf of the organization, acknowledging that anything said or done during those events should never have made her feel any less the Miss America she was, and the Miss America she always will be. 32 years, she did not know it was coming. She had simply been told to stand and wait. And when it arrived, this acknowledgement, this public reckoning on the same stage where it had all begun, she stood there and received it. On the same stage, in the same city, Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the crown had been placed, where the crown had been taken, where 32 years later they finally said we were wrong. You were always Miss America. And now the question that follows from this moment, would America protect her today? If a 21-year-old black woman had photographs published without her consent? If the organization she represented gave her 72 hours to resign or be stripped of her title, would we do better? Would the institutions move faster? Would the hosts keep their jokes? Would the industry close its doors the same way? The answer is complicated. The machinery that destroyed Vanessa Williams in 1984 has not been dismantled. It has been updated. The tools are different. The speed is faster. The audience is larger. And the women who fall, they still fall the same way. What is clear is, this Vanessa Williams did not wait for America to decide to protect her. She protected herself. Her parents put it on her birth announcement in 1963. Here she is Miss America in 1963, when black women were not allowed to compete, when Rule 7 of the pageant explicitly required contestants to be of the white race, when the idea of a black Miss America was not a dream deferred, it was a dream that the institution had taken legal steps to prevent. They wrote it anyway. They were right. They were always right. She was Miss America before she won the crown. She was Miss America after they took it. She was Miss America in every room that tried to close its door to her in every decade of building, when they expected her to disappear in every year that she kept creating, when the easiest thing in the world would have been to stop. The crown was never the point. The woman wearing it was always the point. Everything they tried to use to destroy her, the photographs published without consent, the forced resignation, the decade of punchlines, the closed auditions, the industry that decided her story was over. Before she finished writing it, none of it worked. Not because she was invincible. Not because she never had nights where the weight of it nearly broke her, but because she made a choice in the wreckage of 1984 that they could not make for her. She chose to stay. In an industry that told her to leave, in a country that laughed at her name. In the years when the doors were closed and the jokes were running and the rooms were full of people who had already decided who she was. She stayed, she worked, she built. Grammy nominations, Oscar win, Tony nomination, 3 Emmy nominations. A career that outlasted every person who told a joke at her expense. A name that belongs entirely, irrevocably, permanently to her. They didn't take her crown. They revealed who they were. And she saved every single bit of the best for last. This is not a story about a beauty pageant. This is not a story about a scandal. This is not even a story about one woman. This is a story about what America does with black excellence when it arrives in a form it wasn't prepared for. America celebrated her on a Saturday night and destroyed her by the following summer. And she looked at the wreckage, at everything they had taken, at everything they had tried to take, and she built something they couldn't touch. Not a crown, not a title, not a position that could be surrendered under pressure, a legacy. She was never disqualified. She was abandoned. And she made sure every single day for the 32 years that followed that the world would know the difference. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the truth deserves to be told this clearly, please give this video a like. Subscribe for more stories that go deeper than the headlines. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next case, and until then, keep asking the questions that matter.